Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the vice president of FFF, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show on the internet that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day, the kind of perspective that you're obviously not going to get in the mainstream media. What we're going to do today is talk about what we do here at the Future of Freedom Foundation in terms of presenting an uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, the moral case, the philosophical case. You know, people sometimes ask us, why do you do this? Why don't you kind of like water down the message a little bit, make it more palatable, make it more popular? And there's specific reasons why we don't do this. And so I thought what we would do today is Sheldon and I talk about, you know, our respective reasons, our philosophy behind this methodology, and then give some specific examples of what's going on in the world today as to where our approach is going to be different from, you know, what might be called the reform crowd, the crowd that wants to reform the welfare state or the warfare state, rein it in, and so forth. You know, if you go back to, let's say, 1850 America, and you were asked to help out with the slavery situation, one approach might be that you work for better working conditions for the slaves. You got shorter working hours, not working on Saturdays, 3 meals a day, breaks during the day. And you might say, you know, I'm going to devote my life to that, which would be fine. I mean, you're improving the life for the slaves. That would hold no interest for me, and I think Sheldon too, because what we're interested in, of course, is freedom. And so while improving the lives of slaves is certainly an important thing, it's beneficial, the most important thing is that people have the right to be free. And that pretty much sums up our philosophy here at FFF, that we take the position that the whole welfare state way of life and the warfare state way of life is not freedom. And so while, you know, somebody may come up with a reform plan on Obamacare or, you know, getting rid of Obamacare and whatever, get really excited about that, we take the position that this is not freedom. And what we're interested in is achieving a free society. And I happen to be one of those that thinks a free society is entirely possible. No matter how bad things may look, you never can know the power of ideas and how they can impact a society. So what we keep trying to do is raising people's vision to a higher level. You know, an example of this would be like when the framers were devising the First Amendment. Should they have freedom of speech or not? And, or let's say freedom of religion. And somebody may have said, oh, let's just debate on how we should make the government churches work more efficiently. And there were those that said, no, let's just separate religious activity in the state. And that's the position we take, you know, separate healthcare in the state, separate education in the state, separate economic activity in the state. And so obviously our job is much more difficult than the reform crowd because we're raising people's vision to an entirely new paradigm, a new way of thinking, a different way of thinking. What do you think, Sheldon?
Yeah, it's a very interesting subject. It really is the kind of thing that can be talked about over several of these sessions, actually. I think we can separate the issues a bit. I mean, as far as portraying what we believe is the right ideal, but also fully achievable, in other words, a realistic ideal, it seems to me extremely important that libertarians talk about what it is they want to achieve in the final analysis, the separation of state and economy, separation of school and state, etc. On the other hand, we can point out that in the real world, likely change is likely to be less, something less than complete. I mean, Leonard Read talked about pushing the button to end wage and price controls or rent controls back in the 1940s, late 1940s. And of course that would have been the thing to do. Had there been a button that ended rent control everywhere, the proper position would be to push the button. Of course, that's a good thought experiment, but there are no such buttons. So I think we can anticipate that change usually is going to be less than automatic and immediate anyway. But that doesn't mean we should promote and proposed gradual changes. There was a great line going back to the slavery issue. There's a great line by William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, who said that gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice. In other words, if you're going to advocate gradualism, if you get it, it's going to be a very slow gradualism. If you want a fast gradualism, assuming that's the best we can get, you need to advocate abolition. You need to advocate immediate change. That will at least speed up any timetable, at least to help promote a faster timetable. We could be a little tougher on ourselves on the slavery issue. You talked about something less than abolition of slavery would be improving the conditions of the slaves, but that wasn't exactly a proposal back then. What was a proposal for some people was buying the slaves' freedom from the owners as a way of buying off the owners and minimizing conflict over this. As we know, there was a terrible conflict, 600,000 people killed in that war. And that makes a slightly tougher argument, because owners certainly should not have been compensated, because they might have seen it as having their property taken away, but libertarians know that's not the case. They were the thieves. The abolitionists used the term man-stealers. Slave owners were man-stealers, so they were the thieves. But as a practical matter, people proposed, look, we're not going to get abolition, and we don't want war, so why don't we just buy the freedom of the slaves? Now, there's a moral principle that that would say that's terrible. People shouldn't have to buy their freedom, or other people shouldn't have to buy their freedom. On the other hand, if the only feasible alternative seems to be a war that's going to kill 600,000 people, it now is an interesting subject. But, of course, we're not facing that sort of thing today, and I agree with you completely that on things like schools or the drug war or a whole list of things, abolition, we should not only propose it, but we should demand it.
Well, you mentioned schools. I think this is a classic example of how much more difficult our job is as compared to those that call for reform. So, like if you take vouchers, for instance, I think vouchers are a relatively easy sell, because they assume the argumentation that goes into the voucher position is pretty much an assumption that the public school system continues. And that may not have been what the original idea was. I think the original idea was that vouchers would help put schools out of business. But as it's evolved, the arguments now are that vouchers will even improve the public school system. So it's a relatively easy sell to people. Well, here's a way that you can get essentially a welfare check from the government and take your kid out of public schools and put them into private schools. But we want you to be, to rest assured that the entire public school system will remain in place and everybody will continue having that option. Well, compare that to our position here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, that vouchers are just another form of stealing. It's another welfare program. It's one for the middle class and the poor, and that it makes the whole public school system even a more permanent part of our lives. And so our job, in terms of the uncompromising approach, is much more difficult, because we confront public schooling directly, and we say, it's wrong to be having this kind of system. The damage that it does to people's minds, is just incredible. But more important is this moral case that people have a right to decide the educational decisions of their children. And so our position is that you've got to eliminate government involvement in education. Well, that's a much more difficult process as compared to those that are just calling for vouchers.
Yeah, the voucher issue is interesting. The movement, in a way, is incoherent, because you have part of, approximately half the voucher movement will tell you that vouchers will produce competition, which will make public schools better and give more choice. And then the other half of the movement thinks vouchers will, drive the public schools, the government schools, out of existence. So it can't do both things. So there's an incoherence there. It seems to me a very uneasy alliance. And maybe these days the ones that hope it would drive the schools out of business don't talk about that anymore, because they want to win over adherence. So yeah, that's kind of odd that you would have that big contradiction in this movement. I don't see how it could help but strengthen the government's, maybe not the government schools themselves, but the government's role in education, which is a bigger thing. I don't want to just talk about the schools themselves. I want to talk about the government's role in education. And, having the government expand the payments to people that send their kids to private schools is really just a form of educational imperialism. It's extending the reach of the government over what are today private schools. Now, private schools today still are subject to regulation in every state, varying amounts maybe, but every state. But this seems to me it would create the opportunity for more regulation, because it'll be perceived as so-called public money going to private schools, and people will demand that those schools should be accountable, right? If they're getting public money, using their terms now, if a private institution, private school is getting public money, it ought to be accountable to the public authority. That's going to make sense to most people. And I think they're going to demand that happen. And schools then won't be allowed to be eligible to accept vouchers unless they've complied with rules. And we've seen that happen other places. And I've written about this in a few different places. So it's working out the way we anticipate, that it will lead to greater government intervention, not less.
Yeah, and the recipient of the voucher becomes dependent on the money. I mean, they have budgets. They go out and hire teachers and administrators based on how much money they're bringing in. And if all of a sudden you propose a termination of that voucher, well, now you've got a whole sector of the educational arena that is dependent on money and screaming that, oh, no, we couldn't survive if you take us off the dole. Immigration is another example of this, where, you've got all these complex proposals of, whether there should be a Bracetto program and how many people should be allocated from each country and how many overall immigrants should be entitled to come into America and what should their qualifications be. Our position, the classic one is where you've got people in the freedom movement saying, well, I favor increased levels of immigration. And they bring up all the arguments as to why immigrants are good and therefore why we should have a 5% increase in immigration. Well, that's a much easier sell than the position we take, is that we simply say, open the borders and have free movements of people and, of course, goods and services across borders. Based on the moral case that people have a fundamental right to seek a better way of life, and that includes traveling into another country. Citizenship is an entirely different thing. You don't have the big crisis of whether immigrants should be citizens the way you do under the current system. But our position in terms of open the borders obviously becomes a much more difficult paradigm system to sell to people than it does to simply say, well, the government should let in 5% more, which of course implies that the government ought to be controlling this whole endeavor. And is it any surprise that you have these constant crises that we've pointed out for 23 years when the government is so deeply involved in really what is called socialist central planning in the area of immigration?
Well, and the general theme here is that people don't understand how freedom works. Freedom is the absence of something, right? It's the absence of government engineering, and people don't understand how things work if somebody's not engineering something. They don't understand the idea of unplanned order. They don't understand the idea of economic harmony. They don't understand the idea of self-regulating markets and even more generally self-regulating social processes. And so here we are proposing that the engineer take his hands off the controls, and people then imagine that means it's uncontrolled, although there's an internal logic and therefore control to social processes. It's not chaos we're calling for, but people don't know that. They think it is chaos because they don't. You're telling us to get the engineer's hands off of the levers and the throttle and the pedals and all the knobs and so therefore isn't that going to be chaos? I mean, so it goes back to our most fundamental job, teaching people how freedom works, and people don't understand it.
Yeah, I love the title of Ludwig von Mises's great little book, Planned Chaos, because when the government's planning this thing, like it does in immigration, that's where you end up with chaos, that the market process coordinates people's activities, and therefore you get rid of the chaos that government has produced. And another good example in this is with respect to free trade versus a managed trade agreement, and we saw this during NAFTA when those of us that were opposing this were arguing this is not free trade, and they kept referring to it as a free trade agreement. So here is government, entering into negotiations with another government to lower tariffs on certain goods and keep them on other goods. And, so you've got this monstrosity of a book of free trade in quotation marks, where it's all just government controlled trade. Our position is there should be just total free trade where government isn't involved in the process. And even more fundamentally, that you don't need to negotiate with another government. All you have to do, and Bastiat was so good at presenting this, is just unilaterally drop all your trade restrictions. And that just shocks the managed trade people, like, oh no, well, they'll take advantage of us. It's ridiculous. In other words, free the American people to travel and trade wherever they want, including Cuba, which is a classic example of this managed trade with a cruel and brutal embargo that really is a punishment against the American people, a restriction against them from exercising rights of economic liberty, the right of travel, and so forth. But our position is just open up the borders, free movements of people, free movements of goods and services. That's a whole lot different concept than, hey, the government should get into more managed trade, more, quote, free trade agreements, and mutually agree to lower tariffs and other restrictions.
That's right, and it's another case of where people don't understand how freedom works, and of course they know even less economics. So they imagine if you were to do that, goods would be flowing in, and for some reason no goods would be flowing out, and our paper dollars would be flowing out rather than goods, American-made goods. That's what they think would happen, and they think that would be a terrible thing. Now, as I was telling a class just a couple of weeks ago, the only bad thing about that scenario is that it won't ever happen. What would be wrong with goods flow, all kinds of great stuff that we want flowing in, and the sellers not demanding anything of value in return except paper? And there's no shame in being a paper exporter. I don't know why that's a shame. So we send pieces of green paper with presidents and pictures of presidents on them. That's an honorable trade, making green paper and sending it out. And if people want to give us goods for that, I don't know what they want to do with the paper, but that's not for me to say, right? Values are subjective. Maybe they want to paper their walls with it. Nevertheless, if they want to send us all kinds of cool stuff, and for free, in effect for free, why would we complain about that? The only downside I can see to that is it ain't ever going to happen. But people seem to lose sight of that. And that goes back to the mercantilist idea that Adam Smith devoted his whole, 2 volumes of Wealth of Nations against. This idea that the wealth of a nation comes from, maximizing exports, minimizing imports, and hoarding gold. Somehow that was supposed to be the path to wealth. And Smith said, no, that's not the path to wealth. The path to wealth is access to goods. That's why you want the division of labor. That's why the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So you want to be the market to be as extensive as possible, and that's how we get wealthy. Not this idea that we try to keep our markets closed to others. I mean, people have this idea that in these trade agreements that here's how it goes. Okay, foreigner, we'll reluctantly open our market to your products, but only if you open your market to our products. Now, that seems pretty crazy. That's like saying to the supermarket, okay, I'll take your goods, but you got to buy some stuff from me. I want the goods. Opening my market is not a concession. That's the benefit. Paying for it is the downside. I mean, I'd rather have the stuff for free, but that's not how the world works. So sending stuff away is payment. It's the stuff coming in that's the benefit. So people don't get it, and we got to keep explaining it, and we've been doing it a long time. I mean, even before FFF existed, people were trying to do this. It's a never-ending job, and we have to keep at it.
Well, your concept of subjective value is so important because I think it goes to the heart of trade and economic liberty. I I mean, really, what we're saying is that whenever people enter into an exchange, both sides benefit. Whether that's let's say it's a labor exchange where American businessmen are hiring Mexican immigrants, both sides have benefited, and we know that because if they didn't, from their own different perspective, they wouldn't enter into the exchange. They wouldn't agree to the deal. And the same thing with goods and services, that when there's exchanges taking place, whether it's domestically or internationally, locally, whatever, both sides are benefiting. And so the corollary of that is that whenever any government is interfering with these transactions, that it's interfering with people's pursuit of happiness, their raising of their standard of living, because people's standard of living can increase just through trade because they're giving up something they value less for something they value more. Another example of this, Sheldon, the drug war. A large portion of the movement concentrates on legalizing marijuana, and that's where their focus is. Or they'll say, I favor marijuana legalization, but not cocaine or heroin or meth or, all the other, hard illicit drugs. And we take the uncompromising line, and we have since our inception 23 years ago in the Future Freedom Foundation, that no, you got to legalize all drugs. You legalize it across the board. And so that's obviously a much more difficult sell than just say, let's just legalize marijuana. But our position is, again, that a free society entails the right of an individual to consume whatever he wishes to consume. That doesn't necessarily mean that we approve of your choices, that we condone your choices, that we think, it doesn't mean that we think it's a great thing that you're over there, injecting heroin or snorting cocaine all day long. It's simply saying that this is what a free society is all about. And so these people that say, well, I can go with marijuana legalization, but not the other stuff, I think they lack that fundamental understanding or appreciation of what it means to be free. That you have the right to ingest whatever you want, and when the state can come in and barge down your door and you put you in handcuffs and cart you away because you're ingesting something that they don't approve of, then that's not a free society. And of course, then our secondary argument is that whenever you make any of this stuff illegal, you're going to have a black market. You're going to have all the bad things about a black market, the violence, the corruption, all the things that we see with the overall drug war. And so for those two reasons, we take that uncompromising approach as compared to those that don't.
No, that's true. Once you understand the basic principle, then you'd realize that just legalizing one thing is not what's going to do it. Marijuana is pretty big, and it's a source of a huge amount of money to the people that deal in it. But it would be like trying to remove a cancer, but only partially removing it if you were to leave other contraband laws in place, because you're just going to have black markets and all the evils we're talking about still going on. So, that seems like an easy one. It's been argued that alcohol is more dangerous than some of the things that are outlawed. And so it seems a little bit arbitrary to say, well, we can't legalize this other stuff because it's so dangerous. We'll only legalize marijuana and put it alongside alcohol on the store shelves, when alcohol, kills a lot of people every year, drunk driving and other ways. So it's highly arbitrary. And so it's another case where we have to just keep being as clear as we can be and not get tired in issuing this message in as many different forms as we can to make people see the basic principles. I mean, that's what we're about. We're about getting to the root of things. I mean, that's what the word radical means, and explaining these basic principles so people don't adopt halfway measures or don't extend the principle to areas where it should be extended because they don't understand it.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of libertarianism, or one of the beauties is that there's this consistency here. And that once you understand the principles, as you point out, then you can understand the philosophy. And so you start to recognize, oh, now I see what they're saying. You have a right to ingest whatever you want. That's part of what being a free person's all about. Oh, and you also have the right to enter into mutually beneficial transactions with other people, labor exchanges, economic exchanges, And so all of a sudden people start realizing, hey, there's a consistency here. And it's based on this fundamental principle of the right of people to be free, to live their lives the way they want, as Jefferson said in the Declaration, to pursue happiness, each in his own way. Another good example of this, and we see it right now, Sheldon, is in healthcare. A guy was writing me last week saying, would you sign on to our program to repeal Obamacare? And, there's all this thing about repeal Obamacare and repeal Obamacare. Well, I said, no, I'm not going to waste my time. And that's not the way I live my life. For one thing, to me, it's a futile gesture, even in the short term, that they get it repealed. Obama's going to veto it. And what are their chances of getting a veto over that? But as I told him, I said, you get rid of Obamacare, you're still left with the big crisis, healthcare crisis, that precipitated Obamacare, that led up to it. And so you have this extensive healthcare crisis. And so unless you go to the root of the problem, as you were saying, then what's the point? All you do is just trimming the branches. And what's the root of the problem? Medicare and Medicaid. Those two programs succeeded in destroying the finest healthcare system in the world, a free market healthcare system. That's on the demand side. On the supply side, you've got this enormous restriction of healthcare providers in terms of medical licensure laws. And the best essay on that is Milton Friedman's essay on medical licensure, and it's there on our website at fff.org, but anybody can Google it. It's online. And then all the regulation that goes into healthcare and insurance and so forth. So what we call for is essentially a separation of healthcare and the state. We don't want to talk in terms of, hey, how about getting a healthcare IRA and so forth, because you're going to end up with what Mises called, a crisis after the reform, and then the reform leads to a new crisis, and the crisis leads to new reform. It's time for a total healthcare free market system. And that's a separation of healthcare and the state. Ditch Medicare, ditch Medicaid, ditch insurance and healthcare regulations, medical licensure, totally free up the market in this area.
Yeah, I mean, the intervention goes back to the early 20th century with the formation of the state medical societies, the AMA, which, was always a partner with government in reducing the number of doctors, reducing the number of hospitals, to keep competition down, to keep incomes up. We know good ways we know what free people will do if left alone in this area, because we have the experience of mutual aid societies and what was known as lodge practice, where these organizations, completely voluntary organizations, people joined, and one of the amenities of it was that there was a doctor on contract with the lodge. So if you remember, your family needed to see your GP during the year, as a member of the lodge, you had access, and there might have been a small copay or whatever, but the doctor found it to his interest to join one of these things because he got a regular check during the year, and he had some guaranteed business, but they also in effect got a discount, so that everybody was happy. It was a big selling point to join one lodge rather than another lodge. It was becoming very popular, but organized medicine did not like it, because they saw that it was destroying the more traditional fee for service practice and driving down their incomes. So they crushed it, and through medical licensing and also licensing of hospitals, they were able to take control of the medical industry. And this goes back to the 1910s. This is way before Medicare and Medicaid. So the government has had its fingers in medicine for a very long time. So anybody that implies that Obamacare upset our free market, which is what Romney used to say, destroying our free market system, just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, we're running out of time, and that's a great point. That doctors would provide free health care. I mean, we see it all the time. I heard of a doctor the other day that goes to Haiti regularly. And he's built up a big practice there where he brings in other doctors that work for free to help out the poor. And it's exactly what would happen if you didn't have this system. We're running out of time. There's two areas that we didn't discuss in detail. Let me just throw them out in terms of income taxation. We don't get involved with all it. Well, should there be deductions for this and tax credits for this? We just say abolish it. And you've got Great book on that, Your Money or Your Life, why we should abolish the income tax. And then foreign intervention. Well, should there be foreign aid to Egypt, or well, should there be intervention in Syria? And so you have all these debates over particular interventions and foreign aid. We say non-intervention totally. Bring all the troops home, dismantle the military empire. It's caused so much damage and harm. Leave people free to keep whatever they earn. Liberate the private sector. It all sort of fits together, Sheldon.
Yeah, it certainly does, and maybe we can, spend more time on that in another session, because certainly there's plenty to say about it. But that's right, tinkering, using foreign aid as sort of a carrot, is not what we're out for. We would end it all. Does that mean the government then wouldn't have leverage over foreign governments? We don't want the U.S. government to have leverage over foreign governments. So yeah, it would end leverage. We don't want leverage. The government ought to be withdrawing from the world stage and let trade and other forms of voluntary cooperation take its place.
Yeah, that's really the difference between us and the statists, is that they want to restrict the private sector and liberate the government to go abroad and do all these things, invade, occupy, torture, and so forth. We want to do the exact opposite. We want to rein in the government and liberate the American people to interact and trade with the people of the world. And I ought to mention that you've got 3 books, fantastic books that we've published on some of the things we've talked about today. Tethered Citizens, Time to Repeal the Welfare State, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families, Your Money or Your Life, Why We Must Abolish the Income Tax. You've also got these great monthly webinars. If you guys haven't tuned in on Sheldon's monthly webinars, check them out on our website. They're absolutely fantastic, where he delves into more depth with these concepts. And then we've got our book, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration, and books on gun control and foreign intervention. So you can see it all on our website at fff.org. You can see our mission statement, where we really do take this uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for a free society, because we believe it's the best way, the only way to achieve a free society, which is exactly what we're striving to do. That's the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.